are moments in life when everything seems to be at a standstill, when prayers feel like echoes in an empty room, when the weight of waiting presses down so hard it feels like something inside might break. But can I tell you something today? That moment, the one where you feel like you're at the end of yourself, is often the exact place where God is about to do something miraculous. See, God doesn't need perfect circumstances to move. He doesn't wait for you to have it all figured out, for the bank account to be full, for the relationships to be restored before he shows up. No, God does his best work in the impossible. He speaks into dry bones and brings them to life. He steps into storms and commands peace. He walks into tombs where dreams have been buried and he calls them out. Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough. Maybe you've been praying for so long that you're starting to wonder if God even hears you anymore. Maybe you've been faithful, but nothing seems to be changing and you're on the verge of giving up. But what if I told you that this moment, this tension, this waiting is actually proof that God is up to something? Because the enemy doesn't attack what isn't a threat. The storm doesn't rise against something that isn't moving forward. If you're feeling opposition, if you're feeling resistance, it's not because God has forgotten you. It's because there is a miracle in motion and the enemy is terrified of what's about to be released in your life. Look at the way God works. He gave Abraham a promise of a son, but then he made him wait. He told Joseph he would be a ruler, but then he let him sit in a prison cell. He anointed David as king, but then let him run for his life. Every time the waiting wasn't punishment, it was preparation. And maybe that's what this season is for you. Maybe the silence isn't God ignoring you, it's him positioning you. Maybe the delay isn't denial, it's God making sure everything is ready for the miracle that's about to break forth. Think about the story of Lazarus. When Jesus got the news that his friend was sick, he didn't run to heal him right away. He waited. And by the time he arrived, Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. It looked like it was over. People had given up. The funeral had already happened. But when Jesus called his name, Lazarus walked out of that tomb, because God isn't bound by human timelines. He doesn't work according to what makes sense to us. Sometimes he lets things get to the point where only a miracle will do, so that when it happens, there's no doubt it was him. That's why you can't give up now. That's why you can't let go of hope. Because just when you think it's too late, just when it looks like there's no way, that's when God shows up. Maybe you've been praying for healing and the doctor's report just got worse. Maybe you've been believing for restoration and the situation just got more broken. Maybe you've been asking for a door to open and instead another one just shut. But what if I told you that all of that isn't a sign that God has left? It's a sign that he's setting the stage. Because miracles don't happen when things are easy. They happen when things are impossible. That's why you've got to be ready. You've got to position yourself in faith. You've got to wake up every morning and declare, God, I don't see it yet, but I know you're working. I don't understand it yet, but I trust you. I don't feel it yet, but I believe that you are about to do something beyond what I could ask or imagine. You see, faith isn't just believing when everything looks good. Faith is standing firm when everything looks wrong. Faith is praising before the walls fall, not after. Faith is worshiping in the midnight hour before the prison doors swing open. Faith is putting your net back in the water even after a night of catching nothing, because when Jesus says so, the miracle is already in motion. And some of you are standing at the edge of something right now. You can feel it in your spirit. You know God has something more for you. You can't explain it. But there's this stirring inside of you, this sense that something is shifting. But the miracle requires movement. When Jesus told Peter to step out of the boat, the water didn't turn solid before he moved. It was only when Peter took that step that he walked on water. Maybe your miracle is waiting on your movement. Maybe God is saying, I've already gone before you. I've already made a way, but you've got to step out in faith, because when you trust God, he always meets you there. He always comes through. It might not be how you expected, it might not be on your timeline, but he is always faithful. Think about Joshua and the Israelites at Jericho. God told them to march around the walls for 6 days and not say a word. On the 7th day, they marched again, and then he told them to shout. Can you imagine how crazy that must have felt? Walking in circles, waiting, wondering if anything was even happening. But on that 7th day, when they obeyed, when they lifted their voices in faith, those walls came crashing down. And maybe that's where you are. You've been walking, you've been waiting, you've been trusting, but you're getting tired. Can I encourage you? Don't stop on 6. Don't stop short of what God has promised, because you don't know if this next step, this next prayer, this next act of faith is the one that releases the breakthrough. You've come too far to quit now. You've prayed too many prayers to give up now. You've held on through too much to walk away now. Because when God moves, he moves suddenly. One moment, nothing. The next, everything shifts. One moment, it's just an ordinary day. The next, the door opens. The provision comes. The healing happens. The relationship is restored. But he's looking for people who are ready, people who will stand in faith even when they don't see it yet, people who will keep showing up, keep believing, keep declaring, God, I trust you. So get ready, because what God is about to do in your life is bigger than you imagined. It's going to be a testimony that people will talk about. It's going to be a move that you can't take credit for. It's going to be something so miraculous that when you look back, you'll know only God could have done this. And when it happens, don't forget to give him the glory, because this miracle isn't just for you, it's a testimony for others. It's a reminder that our God is still in the business of making a way where there is no way. So get ready, stay in faith, keep believing, because God is about to do a miracle in your life. God often allows delays not as denial, but as a setup for something greater. Just like Abraham, Joseph, and David had to wait, your waiting season is positioning you for the miracle God has planned. Miracles don't happen in comfort zones. Like Peter stepping out of the boat or Joshua marching around Jericho, your breakthrough might be waiting on your next step of faith. Trust God even when you don't see results yet. When God moves, he moves suddenly. It may seem like nothing is happening, but when the miracle comes, it will be so evident that only God could have done it. Stay expectant, stay faithful, and be ready. There are moments in life when waiting feels like the hardest thing to do. You pray, you believe, you hold on to hope, and yet nothing seems to change. The doors remain closed, the breakthrough feels distant, and the silence from heaven is almost deafening. It's in these seasons that doubt starts creeping in, whispering lies that maybe God has forgotten, maybe the promise isn't coming, maybe you misunderstood what he said. But what if the waiting isn't a sign of abandonment? What if the delay isn't denial? What if instead of wasting time, God is actually using this season to prepare you for what's coming? It's easy to feel like waiting is wasted time. Society teaches us to hustle, to push forward, to make things happen. When something doesn't happen in our timing, we assume something is wrong. We live in a world that values instant results, but God works on a different timeline. He is never in a hurry, yet he is never late. What feels like a delay to us is often divine preparation in disguise. Think about Abraham. God gave him a promise that he would be the father of many nations, yet years passed and nothing seemed to happen. The promise didn't come instantly. In fact, it took 25 years before Isaac was born. Can you imagine waiting that long for something God told you would happen? Can you imagine the nights of wondering if God had changed his mind? The moments of doubt, questioning whether he had misunderstood. But what Abraham didn't know in those years of waiting was that God was working, orchestrating things beyond what he could see. The waiting wasn't wasted. It was a process of shaping his faith, preparing him for the magnitude of the promise. Look at Joseph. He had a dream as a young boy that he would be in a position of great authority, yet his life seemed to go in the opposite direction. He was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. Years passed and nothing looked like the dream God had given him. If anyone had a reason to believe his waiting was wasted, it was Joseph. But in the middle of all that waiting, God was refining him, building his character, teaching him how to lead. Because when the moment finally came, when Pharaoh called him out of the prison to interpret a dream, Joseph was ready. If he had stepped into that position too soon, he wouldn't have been prepared for the weight of responsibility that came with it. And maybe that's where you are right now. Maybe you feel stuck in a place that doesn't match the promise God spoke over your life. Maybe you feel like things are moving in the opposite direction of what you prayed for. But could it be that God is using this season to strengthen you? Could it be that he is building endurance, teaching you to trust him, shaping you into the person who can carry the promise when it comes? Waiting has a way of exposing what's really in our hearts. It tests our faith, our patience, and our trust in God's timing. It forces us to let go of our own control and lean fully on him. Because if we're honest, we often want the blessing, but not the process. We want the miracle, but we don't want the season of refining that comes before it. But God is not just interested in giving you what you're asking for. He's interested in making sure you're ready for it. Think about David. He was anointed as king when he was just a shepherd boy, but he didn't take the throne right away. He spent years in the wilderness, running from Saul, facing battles, being tested. If David had stepped into kingship the moment he was anointed, he wouldn't have been prepared to lead a nation. The years in the wilderness weren't punishment, they were preparation. The struggles weren't meaningless. They were molding him into the king he was destined to be. There is something God does in the waiting that cannot be accomplished any other way. Waiting builds endurance. Waiting teaches dependence. Waiting develops patience. Waiting strengthens faith. If everything came instantly, we wouldn't need faith. If every prayer was answered immediately, we wouldn't learn to trust God's timing. And sometimes what we think is a delay is actually God protecting us. We see only the immediate moment, but God sees the full picture. We think we're ready, but he knows there are things we haven't faced yet, lessons we haven't learned, battles we're not equipped for. There are things God is shielding you from, doors he is keeping closed because he knows that if you stepped into them too soon, they would crush you instead of bless you. Look at the Israelites. God promised them the land of Canaan, a place flowing with milk and honey. But instead of taking the shortest route, he led them through the wilderness, not because he wanted to withhold the promise from them, but because he knew they weren't ready. If they had entered too soon, they wouldn't have been able to handle the battles they would face. So God used the wilderness to prepare them, to strengthen their faith, to teach them to trust him. What if the season you're in right now is your wilderness? What if the waiting isn't punishment but preparation? What if instead of being frustrated, you started asking God, what are you trying to teach me? How are you shaping me in this season? Because if you can trust God in the waiting, if you can remain faithful even when you don't see results, if you can worship even when the breakthrough hasn't come yet, then you are truly ready for what he has ahead. When Jesus was told that Lazarus was sick, he didn't rush to heal him right away. He waited. And by the time he arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. People thought it was too late. But what they didn't understand was that Jesus was about to do something greater than just a healing. He was about to bring resurrection. If he had come earlier, they would have only known him as a healer, but through the waiting, through the delay, they got to see him as the one who has power over death itself. Sometimes what we see as a delay is actually God setting the stage for something even greater than what we asked for. Sometimes he lets things go beyond our control so that when the miracle happens, we know without a doubt that it was him. And that's why you can't give up in the waiting. That's why you can't let discouragement convince you that God has forgotten. If he gave you a promise, He is faithful to fulfill it. But he's not just preparing the blessing for you, he's preparing you for the blessing. So what do you do in the waiting? You stay faithful, you keep showing up, you keep praying, keep worshiping, keep trusting, because when the moment comes, when the door finally opens, when the promise is fulfilled, you'll look back and realize that every moment of waiting was necessary. Every delay had a purpose, every struggle shaped you for the miracle. And when it happens, you'll know it was never wasted time. It was all part of the plan. Faith is more than just believing. It's acting on what you believe. It's easy to say we trust God when things are going well, but real faith is tested in the moments when we have to step forward without knowing what's ahead. Faith is not passive. It's not just sitting back and waiting for something to happen. Faith requires movement. It requires stepping out even when we don't have all the answers. It requires obedience even when it doesn't make sense. It requires trusting that if God has called us, he will make a way. Think about Peter. He was in the boat with the other disciples when he saw Jesus walking on the water. It was a stormy night and the waves were strong. Jesus told them not to be afraid, but it was Peter who had the faith to say, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." That was the moment. Peter could have stayed in the boat. He could have waited until the storm calmed down. He could have asked for more confirmation, but instead he moved. He stepped out of the boat, and for a moment he did the impossible. He walked on water. The miracle didn't happen while Peter was in the boat. It happened when he stepped out. And that's how faith works. It's not enough to just hear the call. You have to move. You have to take a step even when the circumstances don't make sense. You have to believe that if God is calling you into something, he will sustain you in it. So many people miss their miracles because they refuse to move. They stay in the boat, waiting for absolute certainty before they act. But faith doesn't wait for perfect conditions. Faith moves despite uncertainty. Faith moves even when fear is present. Faith moves because it trusts that God will meet us in the step. Look at the story of the 10 lepers. They came to Jesus crying out for healing. And what did Jesus say? He didn't heal them on the spot. Instead, he told them to go and show themselves to the priests. That was a test of faith because at that moment, nothing had changed. They were still sick. They still had leprosy. But as they went, they were healed. The miracle happened in their movement. If they had waited to be healed first before obeying, they would have missed what God had for them. Think about the woman with the issue of blood. For 12 years she suffered. She had tried everything. She had spent all she had on doctors, but nothing worked. She could have stayed home, convinced that nothing would change. She could have let discouragement keep her from moving, but instead she pushed through the crowd. She reached out and touched the hem of Jesus' garment, believing that if she could just touch him, she would be healed. And in that moment, because she moved, power went out from Jesus, and she was made whole. Faith requires action. It requires moving forward even when we don't see the full picture. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, they were terrified. But God told Moses to lift his staff and the waters would part. The sea didn't open first. Moses had to act in faith. He had to stretch out his hand before the miracle happened. And later, when the Israelites reached the Jordan River on their way to the Promised Land, God told them to step into the water. The river didn't stop flowing first. They had to put their feet in. And the moment they stepped in, the waters parted and they walked through on dry ground. God often waits for us to move before he moves. He waits for us to take that step of faith, to act in obedience, even when we don't understand how things will work out. Because faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. So many times we hesitate. We let fear hold us back. We wait for a sign, for more clarity, for a guarantee that everything will work out before we take a step. But that's not how faith works. God calls us to trust him, to step out even when it feels risky, to believe that he is with us even when we can't see the outcome. Look at the story of Naaman. He was a powerful commander, but he had leprosy. He came to Elisha hoping for an instant miracle, expecting something dramatic, but instead Elisha told him to go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times. That didn't make sense to Naaman. He was offended. He thought, aren't there better rivers? Why should I do this? But his servants urged him to obey. And when he finally humbled himself and stepped into the water, his skin was completely restored. The healing came through obedience. The miracle was in the movement. Faith is not about sitting back and waiting for everything to align. It's about taking the step even when things feel uncertain. It's about walking in obedience even when we don't have all the details. It's about believing that when we move in faith, God meets us in the movement. When Jesus told the man at the pool of Bethesda to get up and walk, the man could have said, but I've been here for 38 years. I can't walk. He could have argued. He could have made excuses, but instead he obeyed. He stood up, and in that moment, he was healed. What if your breakthrough is waiting on your obedience? What if the thing you've been praying for is connected to a step of faith you haven't taken yet? What if God is waiting for you to move before he releases the miracle? Faith is more than just believing in our hearts. It's about putting that belief into action. It's about trusting God enough to take a step even when it doesn't make sense. It's about moving forward even when fear tries to hold us back. Sometimes we hesitate because we're afraid of failure. What if I step out and nothing happens? What if I try and it doesn't work? What if I take the risk and I fall? But what if you don't? What if the greatest miracles in your life are waiting on the other side of your obedience? What if God is calling you to step out of the boat, to take a leap of faith, to trust him in a way you never have before? The enemy wants to keep you stuck. He wants to keep you in fear, in hesitation, in doubt. He knows that if you ever truly step out in faith, if you ever truly start walking in obedience, nothing will be able to stop you. Because when you move in faith, heaven moves with you. When the walls of Jericho fell, it wasn't because the Israelites stood still and waited. God told them to march around the city for 7 days, and on the 7th day to lift up a shout. It didn't make sense, but they obeyed. And on that final day, as they lifted their voices, the walls came crashing down. The miracle was in their movement. God is calling you to trust him, to step out, to move forward. Maybe it's in your career, maybe it's in your relationships, maybe it's in your ministry, maybe it's in something you've been hesitant about for a long time. But if you keep waiting for the perfect moment, you'll miss what God is trying to do in your life. Faith requires movement. It requires stepping forward even when you don't have all the answers. It requires believing that God is already ahead of you, making a way where there seems to be no way. It requires trusting that when you move in obedience, the miracle will follow. The question isn't whether God is able. The question is whether you're willing to take the step. Because the breakthrough, the blessing, the provision, the healing, it's waiting on the other side of your obedience. And when you move, when you step out in faith, you'll see that God has been there all along, waiting for you to trust him enough to take that first step. There are moments in life when it feels like God is taking too long. You pray, you believe, you hold on to his promises, but nothing seems to change. The situation stays the same. The breakthrough doesn't come. And you start wondering if God has forgotten you. But what if the delay isn't a denial? What if the timing that feels so frustrating is actually part of a perfect plan? God's timing is never off. It may not align with our expectations, but it is always right. He is never late, never early, always right on time. It's hard to see this when you're in the middle of waiting. When you've been asking God for something and it hasn't happened yet, it's easy to feel discouraged. But throughout the Bible, God has shown that his timing is intentional. He doesn't just give miracles randomly. He sets things in motion at the exact moment they are needed. He moves in ways that don't always make sense in the moment, but when you look back, you realize that his hand was orchestrating everything perfectly. Look at Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child, Yet years went by and nothing happened. They got older, their situation seemed more impossible, and they probably felt like time was running out. In their frustration, they even tried to take matters into their own hands, leading to mistakes that caused pain. But despite their doubts, God remained faithful. At the right time, when it seemed humanly impossible, Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac. If it had happened earlier, they would have thought it was because of their own strength. But because it happened when only God could have done it, there was no question that it was a miracle. God's timing isn't just about making sure you get what you want. It's about making sure He gets the glory. If things happened according to our schedule, we might take credit. We might believe that our own efforts made it happen. But when God moves in His timing, it becomes undeniable that only He could have done it. Think about Lazarus. When Jesus heard that his friend was sick, He didn't rush to heal him. He stayed where he was for 2 more days. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. To everyone watching, it seemed like Jesus had missed the opportunity to do something. But Jesus knew exactly what He was doing. If He had arrived earlier, people would have only seen Him as a healer. But by waiting until Lazarus was in the tomb, He revealed something greater, His power over death. When He called Lazarus out of the grave, there was no denying that this was a miracle. Sometimes God lets things go beyond our control so that when the breakthrough comes, we know it wasn't us, it was Him. Sometimes He allows situations to seem impossible so that when the miracle happens, no one can deny that He is the one who made it possible. He waits for the perfect moment because He is not just interested in the miracle, He's interested in revealing more of Himself to us through it. Look at Joseph. As a young boy, he had a dream that he would be in a position of power. But instead of stepping into that promise immediately, his life took a series of unexpected turns. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison. Year after year, it looked like he was moving further away from what God had shown him. But in one day, everything changed. In one day, he was taken from the prison and placed in the palace. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was God's perfect timing. If Joseph had been released earlier, he wouldn't have been positioned to interpret Pharaoh's dream. If he had been freed later, he might have missed the opportunity. God orchestrated every step, even the painful ones, to lead him to the exact moment when he was needed. And maybe that's what God is doing in your life right now. Maybe you're in a season where it feels like nothing is happening, like you're stuck in a place that doesn't make sense. But what if God is setting things up behind the scenes? What if the delay is not a delay at all, but a divine strategy to position you for something greater? God doesn't waste time. Every moment, every step, every challenge is part of a bigger picture that you can't see yet. When you're in the middle of it, it's hard to understand. But when you look back, you'll see that God was working all along. He was aligning people, preparing opportunities, and getting you ready for the moment when everything would come together. Look at the Israelites. God promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, but they had to go through the wilderness first. They spent years in a place they didn't expect, wondering why it was taking so long. But in that waiting, God was preparing them. He was teaching them to trust Him, strengthening their faith, and shaping them for what was ahead. If they had entered the promised land too soon, they wouldn't have been ready to handle it. The waiting wasn't a punishment. It was preparation. God's timing is not just about when, it's also about how. Sometimes we expect Him to move in a certain way, and when He doesn't, we assume He isn't working. But God's ways are higher than ours. He sees the full picture, and He knows exactly how things need to happen. When the Israelites were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, they thought they were out of options. But God had a plan they couldn't see. He parted the sea, making a way where there was no way. And that's what He does. He moves in ways that don't always make sense, but when He does, the miracle is always worth the wait. Sometimes we get impatient. We want things to happen now. We want the answer, the breakthrough, the blessing immediately. But if we truly trust God, we have to trust His timing. We have to believe that if something hasn't happened yet, it's because He is working in ways we don't understand. God's perfect timing is not just about what He's doing, it's also about what He's doing in us. Sometimes the wait is necessary because we're not ready yet. Sometimes He needs to refine our hearts, strengthen our faith, or develop our character before we can handle the blessing. Sometimes He is teaching us dependence, showing us that He is enough, even before the miracle comes. When Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding in Cana, He didn't do it immediately. He waited until the wine had run out. Why? Because if He had done it too soon, no one would have recognized the miracle. But by waiting until there was nothing left, He made it clear that what happened was supernatural, and that's how He works in our lives. He waits until we reach the point where we know we can't do it on our own. He waits until we've exhausted our own strength, our own ideas, our own plans, so that when He moves, we recognize His power. God is never late. He is never caught off guard. He is always working, even when you don't see it. And when His timing unfolds, you will realize that every moment of waiting was worth it. Every delay had a purpose. Every unanswered prayer was setting you up for something better than what you expected. So don't lose hope. Don't let discouragement convince you that God has forgotten you. If He gave you a promise, He will fulfill it. If He spoke something over your life, He will bring it to pass. It may not happen in your timing, but when it happens, it will be undeniable. And when you see what God has been preparing for you, you will understand why He made you wait. His